Part 2. Everything is permitted. Nothing is true. Dogma Sicarii 1. Chapter 49. It was late in the spring of the year of our Lord 1504. The Pope tore open the letter a courier had just brought him, scanned it, then banged a meaty fist down on his desk in triumph. The other hand held up the letter, from which heavy seals dangled. "God bless King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Aragon and Castile," he cried. "Good news, Your Holiness," asked Ezio, seated in a chair across from him. Julius II smiled darkly. "Yes. Cesare Borgia has been safely delivered into one of their strongest and most remote rocca." "Where?" "Ah, that's classified information, even to you. I can't take any chances with Cesare." Ezio bit his lip. Had Julius guessed what he'd do if he knew the location? Julius continued reassuringly. "Don't look so downcast, dear Ezio. I can tell you this. It's a massive fortress, lost in the plains of central northeastern Spain, and totally impregnable." Ezio knew that Julius had had his reasons for not having Cesare burned at the stake, in case it made a martyr of him, and he acknowledged that this was the next best thing. But still Cesare's words haunted him. "Chains will never hold me." Ezio felt in his heart that the only thing that would hold Cesare securely was death. But he smiled his congratulations anyway. "They've got him in a cell at the top of the central keep, in a tower 140 feet high," Julius continued. "We don't have anything more to worry about as far as he's concerned." The Pope looked at Ezio keenly. "What I've just told you is also classified information, by the way, so don't go getting any ideas. In any event, at a word from me, they'll switch the location, just in case anyone goes looking for him and I get wind of it." Ezio let it go and changed tack. "And Lucrezia? Do we have any news from Ferrara?" "Well, her third marriage seems to be doing her good, though I must admit I was worried at first. The d'Este family are such a bunch of snobs that I thought the old Duke would never accept her as a suitable wife for his son. Marrying a Borgia. Talk about marrying beneath you. To them it would be a bit like you getting hitched to your scullery maid." The Pope laughed heartily. "But she's settled down. Not a peep out of her. She's taken to exchanging love letters and even poems with her old friend Pietro Bembo. All above board, of course." Here Julius winked broadly. "But she is basically a good and faithful wife to Duke Alfonso. She even goes to church and embroiders tapestries. Of course, there's no question of her coming back to Rome, ever. She'll end her days in Ferrara, and she should be thankful she's got away with her head still on her shoulders. All in all, I think it's safe to say that we've got that flock of Catalan perverts out of our hair for good." Ezio wondered if the Vatican spy ring was as well informed about the Templars as they were about the Borgia. Cesare had been their leader, and continued to be so, even from prison. But about this the Pope kept his counsel. He had to admit that the affairs of Italy had seen worse days than these. They had a strong Pope who'd had the sense to retain Agostino Chigi as his banker, and the French were on the back foot. King Louis hadn't left Italy, but he had at least withdrawn to the north, where he seemed content to dig in. In addition, the French king had ceded Naples to King Ferdinand of Aragon. "I hope so, Your Holiness." Julius looked at Ezio keenly. "Listen, Ezio, I'm not a fool, so don't take me for one. Why do you think I brought you in as my counsellor? I know there are still pockets of Borgia loyalists around the countryside, and even a few diehards left in the city, but I have other enemies than the Borgia to worry about these days." "The Borgia could still pose a threat." "I don't think so." "And what are you doing about your other enemies?" "I'm reforming the Papal Guard. Have you seen what good soldiers the Swiss are? Best mercenaries of the lot. And since they won independence from the Holy Roman Empire and Maximilian 5 or 6 years ago, they've been putting themselves out to hire. They're totally loyal and not very emotional. Such a change from our own dear fellow countrymen. And I'm thinking of getting a brigade of them put together as my personal bodyguard. I'll arm them with the usual halberds and stuff, but I'm also issuing them with Leonardo's muskets." He paused. "All I need is a name for them." He looked at Ezio quizzically. "Any ideas?" "How about the Swiss Guard?" suggested Ezio, who was a little tired. The Pope considered this. "Well, it's not startlingly original, Ezio. Frankly, I rather favoured the Julian Guard, but one doesn't like to sound too egotistical." He grinned. "All right, I'll use what you propose. It'll do for the time being, at any rate." They were interrupted by the sound of hammering and other building works coming from above their heads and other parts of the Vatican. "Wretched builders," commented the Pope. "Still, it has to be done." He crossed the room to a bell pull. "I'll get someone to go and shut them up until we've finished. Sometimes I think builders are the greatest destructive force man has yet invented." An attendant arrived at once, and the Pope gave him his orders. Minutes later, amid muffled swearing, tools were downed noisily. "What are you having done?" asked Ezio, knowing that architecture vied with warfare as the Pope's two greatest passions. "I'm having all the Borgia apartments and offices boarded up," replied Julius. "Far too sumptuous, more worthy of a Nero than the leader of the church. And I'm raising all their buildings on the roof of the Castel Sant'Angelo. I'll turn it into one big garden. I might even stick a little summer house up there." "Good idea," said Ezio, smiling to himself. The summer house would doubtless be a real pleasure dome, fit, if not for a king, at least for trysts with one or other of the Pope's mistresses, female or male. The Pope's private life didn't concern Ezio. What mattered was that he was a good man and a staunch ally, and compared with Rodrigo, his corruptions were about as significant as a child's tantrums. Furthermore, he'd steadily continued the moral reforms of his predecessor, Pius III. "I'm having the Sistine Chapel done up as well," continued the Pope. "It's so dull. So I've commissioned that bright young artist from Florence, Michelangelo what's-his-name, to paint some frescoes on the ceiling. Lots of religious scenes, you know the kind of thing. I thought of asking Leonardo, but his head's so full of ideas that he scarcely ever finishes a big painting. It's a pity. I rather liked that portrait he did of Francesco del Giacondo's wife." Julius interrupted himself and looked at Ezio. "But you didn't come here to talk about my interest in modern art?" "No." "Are you sure you're not taking the threat of a Borgia revival too seriously?" "I think we should take it seriously." "Look, my army has regained most of the Romagna for the Vatican. There's no army left for the Borgia to fight with." "Cesare is still alive, with him as a figurehead." "I hope you're not questioning my judgment, Ezio. You know my reasons for sparing his life. In any case, where he is now, he's as good as buried alive." "Micheletto is still at large." "Pah! Without Cesare, Micheletto is nothing." "Micheletto knows Spain well." "He's nothing, I tell you." "He knows Spain. He was born in Valencia. He's the bastard nephew of Rodrigo." The Pope, who, despite his years, was a large and vigorous man still in the prime of his life, had been pacing the room during this last exchange. Now he returned to the desk, placed his large hands on it, and leant threateningly over Ezio. His manner was convincing. "You are letting your worst fears run away with you," he said. "We don't even know whether Micheletto is still alive or not." "I think we should find out once and for all." The Pope pondered Ezio's point and relaxed slightly, sitting down again. He tapped the heavy signet ring on his left hand with the index finger of his right. "What do you want to do?" he asked heavily. "Don't expect any resources from me. The budget's overstretched as it is. The first thing is to locate and destroy any last diehards in the city of Rome itself. We may find someone who knows something about Micheletto, his whereabouts or his fate. Then, if he's still alive, you'll destroy him." "Yes." unless he turns out to be more useful to me alive, Ezio thought. Julius sat back. I'm impressed by your determination, Ezio. It almost frightens me. And I'm glad I'm not an enemy of the assassins myself. Ezio looked up sharply. You know about the Brotherhood? The Pope made a tent of his fingers. I always needed to know who the enemies of my enemy were. But your secret is safe with me. As I told you, I am not a fool. Chapter 50. Your instinct is right. I will guide you and guard you. But I do not belong to you, and soon you must let me go. I have no power over him that controls me. I must obey the will of the master of the apple. Ezio was alone in his secret lodgings, holding the apple in his hands as he tried to use it to help him locate his quarry in Rome, when the mysterious voice came to him again. This time he could not tell if the voice was male or female, or whether it came from the apple or somewhere in his mind. Your instinct is right, but also I have no power over him that controls me. Why then had the apple shown him only hazy images of Micheletto, just enough to tell him that Cesare's henchman was still alive? And it could not, or would not, pinpoint Cesare's location, at least for now. Suddenly Ezio realized something his inner self had always known, that he should not abuse its power by overusing it, and that he should not become dependent on the apple. Ezio knew that it was his own will that had blurred the answers he sought. He must not be slothful. He must fend for himself. One day he would have to again anyway. He thought of Leonardo. What could that man not do if he had the apple? And Leonardo, the best of men, nevertheless invented weapons of destruction as easily as he produced sublime paintings. Might the apple not only have the power to help mankind, but to corrupt it? In Rodrigo's or Cesare's hands, if either of them had ever been able to master it, it could have become the instrument not of salvation, but destruction. Power is a potent drug, and Ezio did not want to fall victim to it. He looked at the apple again. It seemed inert in his hands now, but as he placed it back in its box, he found he could hardly bear to close the lid. What paths could it not open up for him? No, he must bury it. He must learn to live by the code without it. But not yet. He had always sensed in his heart that Micheletto lived. Now he knew it for a fact. And while he lived, he would do his utmost to free his evil master, Cesare. Ezio had not told Pope Julius his full plan. He intended to seek out Cesare and kill him, or die in the attempt. It was the only way. He would use the apple only when he had to. He had to keep his own instincts and powers of deduction sharp in anticipation of the day when the apple would no longer be in his possession. He would hunt down the Borgia diehards in Rome without it. Only if he failed within 3 days to unearth them would he resort to its power again. He still had his friends, the girls of the Rosa in Fiore, La Volpe's thieves, and his fellow assassins. And with their help, how could he fail? Ezio knew that the apple would, in ways he could not fully comprehend, help him, as long as he respected its potential. Perhaps that was its secret. Perhaps no one could ever fully master it, except a member of the race of ancient adepts who had left the world in trust to humanity, to make or break it as their will elected. He closed the lid and locked the box. Ezio summoned a meeting of the Brotherhood on Tiber Island that night. "My friends," he started, "I know how hard we have striven, and I believe that victory may be in sight, but there is still work to do." The others, all except Machiavelli, looked at each other in surprise. "But Cesare is muzzled," cried La Volpe, "for good." "And we have a new pope, who has always been an enemy of the Borgia," added Claudia. And the French are driven back, put in Bartolomeo. The countryside is secure, and the Romagna is back in papal hands. Ezio held out a hand to quieten them. We all know that a victory is not a victory until it is absolute. And Cesare may indeed be muzzled, but he lives, said Machiavelli quietly. And Micheletto. Exactly, Ezio said. And as long as there are pockets of Borgia diehards, both here and in the Papal States, there is still seed from which a Borgia revival may grow. You are too cautious, Ezio. We have won, cried Bartolomeo. Barto, you know as well as I do that a handful of city-states in the Romagna remain loyal to Cesare. They are strongly fortified. Then I'll go and sort them out. They will keep. Caterina Sforza's army is not strong enough to attack them from Forli, but I have sent messengers requesting that she keep a close eye on them. I have a more pressing job for you. Oh, God, thought Ezio. Why does my heart still skip a beat when I mention her name? Which is? I want you to take a force to Ostia and keep watch on the port. I want to know about any suspicious ships coming in and out of the harbour. I want you to have messengers on horseback ready to bring news to me here the instant you have anything to report. Bartolomeo snorted. Sentry duty? Hardly the sort of work for a man of action like me. You will get as much action as you need when the time is right to move against the rebel city-states I've mentioned. In the meantime, they live in hope, waiting for a signal. Let them live in hope. It'll keep them quiet. Our job is to snuff out that hope, forever. Machiavelli smiled. I agree with Ezio, he said. Well, all right, if you insist, Bartolomeo replied grumpily. Pantasilea will enjoy the sea air after her ordeal. Bartolomeo brightened. I hadn't thought of that. Good. Ezio turned to his sister. Claudia, I imagine the change of regime hasn't affected business at the Rosa in Fiore too badly. Claudia grinned. It's funny how even princes of the church find it hard to keep the devil between their loins in abeyance, however many cold baths they say they take. Tell your girls to keep their ears to the ground. Julius has the College of Cardinals firmly under his control, but he still has plenty of enemies with ambitions of their own, and some of them might just be mad enough to think that if they could free Cesare, they could use him as a means of furthering their own ends. And keep an eye on Johann Burchard, too. What? Rodrigo's master of ceremonies? Surely he's harmless enough. He hated having to organize all those orgies. Isn't he just a functionary? Nevertheless, anything you hear, especially if it's about die-hard factions still at large here in Rome, let me know. It'll be easier now that we no longer have Borgia guards breathing down our necks every minute of the day. Ezio smiled a little absently. I have another question to ask. I have been too busy to visit, and it troubles me. But how is our mother? Claudia's face clouded. She keeps the accounts, but, Ezio, I fear she is failing. She seldom goes out. She speaks more and more often of Giovanni, and of Federico and Petruccio. Ezio fell silent for a moment, thinking of his lost father and brothers. I will come when I can, he said. Give her my love, and ask her to forgive my neglect. She understands the work you have to do. She knows that you do it not only for the good of us all, but for the sake of our departed kinsmen. The destruction of those who killed them shall be their monument, said Ezio, his voice hard. And what of my people? Asked La Volpe. Gilberto, your people are vital to me. My recruits remain loyal, but they see that life returns to normal, and most of them long to return to the lives they led before we persuaded them to join us in the struggle to throw off the Borgia yoke. They retain their skills, but they are not sworn members of the Brotherhood, and I cannot expect them to bear the yoke that we bear, for it is a yoke that only death will relieve us of. I understand. I know the men and women under your command are city-bred. Some country air will make a change. How do you mean? asked La Volpe suspiciously. "Send your best people into the towns and villages around Rome. There will be no need to go further out than Viterbo, Terni, L'Aquila, Avezzano, and Nettuno. I doubt if, beyond the rough circle round Rome that those towns define, we'd find much. There can't be many diehards left, and those there are will want to be within striking distance of Rome. They'll be hard to find. You must try. You know yourself how even a small force in the right place can do untold damage. I'll send out my best thieves and disguise them as peddlers. Report anything you find back to me, especially news of Micheletto. Do you really think he's still out there somewhere? Mightn't he have gone back to Spain, or at least the Kingdom of Naples? If he isn't dead already, that is. I'm convinced he's still alive. La Volpe shrugged. That's good enough for me. When the others had gone, Machiavelli turned to Ezio and said, What about me? You and I will work together. Nothing would give me greater pleasure, but before we go into details, I have a question. Go ahead. Why not use the apple? Ezio, sighing, explained as best he could. When he'd finished, Machiavelli looked at him, took out his little black notebook and wrote in it at length. Then he stood up, crossed the room, and sat down next to Ezio, squeezing his shoulder affectionately as he did so. Any such gesture from Machiavelli was as rare as hen's teeth. Let's get down to business, he said. This is what I have in mind, said Ezio. Tell me. There are women in this city who may help us. We must seek them out and talk to them. Well, you picked the right man for the job. I am a diplomat. Gaining access to the first was easy. Pope Julius had seen to that. But getting her to talk wasn't. She received them in a sumptuous parlour on the piano nobile of her large house, whose windows, on 4 sides, provided sublime vistas of the once great city, now part crumbling, but also part magnificent, after the last few popes had poured money into self-aggrandizement. I don't see how I can help you, she said, after listening to them, although Ezio noticed that she didn't meet their eyes. If there are pockets of diehards in the city, we need to know about them, Altezza, and we need your help, said Machiavelli. If we find out later that you have held out on us— Don't threaten me, young man, retorted Vanozza. Dio mio. Do you know how long ago it is since Rodrigo and I were lovers? Well over 20 years. Perhaps your children? Asked Ezio. She smiled grimly. I expect you're wondering how a woman like me could have produced such a brood, she said. But I tell you there is very little Catanei blood in them. Well, in Lucrezia perhaps, but Cesare— She broke off, and Ezio could see the pain in her eyes. Do you know where he is? I know no more than you do, and I don't care to. It's years since I've even seen him, though we lived in the same city. He's dead to me. Clearly the Pope was being very careful to keep Cesare's whereabouts secret. Perhaps your daughter knows. If I don't, why should she? She lives in Ferrara now. You could go and ask her, but it's a long way north, and the Holy Father has forbidden her ever to return to Rome. Do you see her? Asked Machiavelli. Vanozza sighed. As I said, Ferrara's a long way north. I don't care to travel much these days. She looked around the room, glancing at the servants who stood near the door, and occasionally at the water clock. She had offered them no refreshment, and seemed eager for them to go. An unhappy woman, she seemed ill at ease and constantly kneaded her hands together. But was that because she was concealing something, or because she was being forced to talk about people she'd clearly rather not discuss? I have, or rather had, 8 grandchildren, she said unexpectedly. Ezio and Machiavelli knew that Lucrezia had had several children by her various husbands, but few had survived childhood. People said that Lucrezia had never taken pregnancy very seriously, and that she had a habit of partying and dancing right up to the moment of her accouchement. Had that alienated her from her mother? Cesare had a daughter, Louisa, who was a child of 4. "Do you see any of them?" asked Machiavelli. "No. Louisa is still in Rome, I think, but her mother has made sure that she's more French than Italian." She rose then, and the servants, as if on cue, opened the room's ornate double doors. "I wish I could be of more assistance." "We thank you for your time," said Machiavelli, dryly. "There are other people you might like to talk to," said Vanozza. "We intend to visit the Princesse d'Albret." Vanozza pressed her lips together. "Buona fortuna," she said, without conviction. "You'd better hurry, too. I hear she's making preparations to leave for France. Perhaps, if I'm lucky, she'll come and say goodbye." Ezio and Machiavelli had risen too, and made their farewells. Once outside in the street, Machiavelli said, "I think we'll have to use the apple, Ezio." "Not yet." "Have it your own way, but I think you're a fool. Let's go and see the princess. Lucky we can both speak French." "Charlotte d'Albret won't be leaving for France today. I've got men watching her palazzo. There's someone else I want to see first. In fact, I'm surprised Vanozza didn't mention her." "Who?" "Giulia Farnese." "Doesn't she live in Carbognano these days?" "My spies tell me she's in town, so we ought to take advantage of that." "What makes you think we'll get any more out of her than we got out of Vanozza?" Ezio smiled. Giulia was Rodrigo's last mistress, and he was passionate about her. "I remember when the French captured her. He was beside himself. And then the French foolishly ransomed her for 3,000 ducats. He'd have paid 20 times that amount to get her back. He'd probably have struck any kind of deal they wanted. But I guess that's what happens when your mistress is over 40 years younger than you are. You get besotted. It didn't stop him dumping her when she turned 25, though. Yes, she was too old for him by then. Let's hurry." They made their way north, through the narrow streets in the direction of the Quirinale. On the way, Machiavelli noticed that Ezio was becoming increasingly ill at ease. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Have you not noticed anything?" "What?" "Don't look round." Ezio was terse. "No?" "I think we're being followed. By a woman." "Since when?" "Since we left Vanozza's palazzo." "One of her people?" "Perhaps." "Alone?" "I think so." "Then we'd better shake her." Impatient though they were to get on, they slowed their pace, looking in shop windows and even pausing at a wine booth. There, over the rim of his beaker, Ezio caught sight of a tall, athletically built, blonde woman dressed in a good but unassuming dark green robe of a lightweight material. She'd be able to move fast in clothes like that if the need arose. "I've got her," he said. They both scanned the wall of the building against which the booth was erected. It was a new place, constructed in a fashionably rusticated style of large roughened slabs of stone separated by sunken joints. At intervals, iron rings for tethering horses had been let into the wall. It was perfect. They made their way to the back of the booth, but there was no way out there. "We'll have to be quick," said Machiavelli. "Watch me," replied Ezio, putting his beaker down on a table near the entrance. A few seconds later, he was halfway up the wall with Machiavelli close behind him. Bystanders gaped as the two men, their capes fluttering in the breeze, disappeared over the rooftops, leaping across alleyways and streets, sending tiles skeetering down to smash on the cobbles or flop in the mud of unmade lanes as the people below ducked or jumped out of the way. Even if she'd been able to, the woman couldn't climb vertical walls in a long skirt. But Ezio saw that her dress had a carefully disguised slit to the thigh on one side, enabling her to run, and she was tearing through the streets after them, thrusting aside anyone who got in her way. Whoever she was well trained. At last they lost her. Breathing hard, they came to a halt on the roof of Sant Niccolo de Portis, and lay down flat, keenly scanning the streets below. There seemed to be no one unduly suspicious amongst the citizens in the streets, though Ezio thought he recognized two of La Volpe's thieves working the crowd, using sharp little knives to cut purses. Presumably they were two who hadn't been selected to go out into the surrounding countryside, but he'd have to ask Gilberto about that later. "Let's go down," suggested Machiavelli. "No. It's easier to stay out of sight up here, and we haven't far to go." She didn't seem to have much trouble following us. Lucky for us, there was that roof with a high wall round it where we could change direction without her noticing. Ezio nodded. Whoever she was, she'll be reporting back by now. He wished she were on their side. As things stood, they'd have to get to the large apartment Julia kept in Rome, and then get out of the Quirinale district fast. Maybe he should detail a couple of his recruits to watch their backs on any future forays. The Borgia diehards were lying low under the new pope's tough regime, but only to lull the authorities into a false sense of security. Giulia's first husband, Orsino Orsini, had been happy to turn a blind eye to the affair his 19-year-old wife had embarked on with the 62-year-old Rodrigo Borgia. She had a daughter, Laura, but no one knew if she was the child of Orsino or Rodrigo. Rodrigo, despite being a Valencian by birth, had risen through the church until he controlled the Vatican's purse strings, and he had shown his gratitude to his delicious young mistress by installing her in a brand-new house, which she'd long since been obliged to quit, conveniently close to the Vatican, and by making her brother Alessandro a cardinal. The other cardinals called him the Cardinal of the Skirts behind his back, though of course never in Rodrigo's presence. Julia they called the Bride of Christ. Ezio and Machiavelli dropped to the ground in the piazza onto which the princess's apartment block fronted. A couple of papal guards stood nearby, but otherwise the square was deserted. The guards' tunics bore on their shoulders the crest of the Della Rovere family, a massive oak tree, root and branch, now surmounted by the triple tiara and the keys of St. Peter. Ezio recognized the men. 6 months earlier, they'd been in Borgia livery. How times had changed, as now they saluted him, and he acknowledged them. "Fuckers," said Machiavelli under his breath. "A man's got to work," said Ezio. "I'm surprised that you, of all people, can take issue with such a bagatelle. Come on." They'd arrived without due notice, and it took some trouble to convince the Farnese attendants, 6 blue fleur-de-lis ranged on a yellow background on their capes, to admit them, but as Ezio knew, Signora Farnese was at home. She received them in a room that was half as gaudy but twice as tasteful as Lavanozza's. At 30, she had more than retained the beauty of her youth, and the intelligence that informed it. Despite them being unexpected guests, the Signora had Moscato and Panpettati e Mielati served for them immediately. It soon became clear that she knew nothing and was innocent of any Borgia taint, despite her previous closeness to that execrable family, as Machiavelli called them. Machiavelli saw that she had moved on, and when he and Ezio asked her about her once close friendship with Lucrezia, all she said was, "What I saw of her was her good side. I think she fell too much under the bullying sway of her father and brother. Thank God she is rid of them." She paused. If only she had met Pietro Bembo earlier. Those two were soulmates. He might have taken her to Venice and saved her from her dark side. "Do you see her still?" "Alas, Ferrara is so far to the north, and I have my hands full running Carboniano. Even friendships die, Ezio Auditore." An image of Caterina Sforza blew into his mind before he had a chance to extinguish it. Ah, God, how the thought of her caught at his heart still. It was late afternoon by the time they left. They kept a close eye out for anyone shadowing them, but there was nobody. "We must use the apple," said Machiavelli again. "This is but the first day of 3. We must learn to trust ourselves and our own intelligence, and not lean on what has been vouchsafed us. The matter is pressing. One more appointment today, Niccolo, then perhaps we shall see." The Princesse d'Albret, Dame de Chaloux, Duchess of Valentinois, was, according to the gatekeepers of her opulent villa in the Pinciano district, not at home. But Ezio and Machiavelli, impatient and tired, pushed past anyway, and encountered Charlotte in her piano nobile, engrossed in packing. Huge chests full of costly linen and books and jewellery stood about the half-empty room, and in a corner, the confused little 4-year-old Louisa, Cesare's only legitimate heir, played with a wooden doll. "You are damned impertinent," said the cold-looking blonde who confronted them, her dark brown eyes flashing fire. "We have the imprimatur of the Pope himself," lied Ezio. "Here is his warrant." He held up a blank parchment, from which impressive-looking seals hung. "Bastards," said the woman coolly. "If you think I know where Cesare is imprisoned, you are fools. I never want to see him again, and I pray that none of his sang maudit has passed into the veins of my innocent little daughter." "We also seek Micheletto," said Machiavelli implacably. "That Catalan peasant," she spat. "How should I know?" "Your husband told you how he might escape if taken," suggested Machiavelli. "He depended on you." "Do you think so? I don't. Perhaps Cesare confided in one of his dozens of mistresses. Perhaps the one that gave him the malatia venerea. I never touched him after the first pustules appeared, and he at least had the decency to keep away from me and wallow in the gutter with his whores from then on. And father 11 brats by them. At least I am clean, and my daughter too. As you see, I am getting out of here. France is a far better country than this wretched hellhole. I'm going back to La Motte Feuilly." "Not to Navarre?" asked Machiavelli slyly. "I see you are trying to trick me." She turned her cold, bony face towards them, and Ezio noticed that her beauty was marred, or enhanced, by a dimple in the middle of her chin. "I do not choose to go to that province merely because my brother married the heiress to the throne and thereby became king." "Does your brother remain faithful to Cesare?" asked Ezio. "I doubt it. Why don't you stop wasting my time and go and ask him?" "Navarre is far away." "Exactly, which is why I wish you and your saturnine friend were on your way there. And now it is late and I have work to do. Please leave." "A wasted day," commented Machiavelli as they took to the streets again, the shadows lengthening. "I don't think so. We know that none of those closest to Cesare are harbouring or protecting him." Ezio paused. "All the most important women in his life hated him, and even Julia had no time for Rodrigo." Machiavelli grimaced. "Imagine being fucked by a man old enough to be your grandfather." "Well, she didn't do too badly out of it." "We still don't know where Cesare is. Use the apple." "No, not yet. We must stand on our own feet." "Well," sighed Machiavelli, "at least God gave us good minds." At that moment, one of Machiavelli's spies came running up out of breath. He was a small, bald man with alert eyes and a wild face. "Bruno," said Machiavelli, surprised and concerned. "Maestro," panted the man, "thank God I found you." "What is it?" "The Borgia diehards. They sent someone to follow you and Maestro Ezio." "And?" "Sure that you were out of the way. They have taken Claudia." "My sister! Sweet Jesus! How?" gasped Ezio. "She was in the square outside St. Peter's. You know those rickety wooden colonnades the Pope wants to tear down? Get on with it. They took her. She was organising her girls, getting them to infiltrate." "Where is she now?" "They have a hideout in the Prati, just to the east of the Vatican. That's where they've taken her." Bruno quickly gave them the details of where Claudia was being held prisoner. Ezio looked at Machiavelli. "Let's go," he said. "At least we've found out where they are," said Machiavelli, dryly as ever, as the two of them bounded up to the rooftops again, running and leaping across Rome until they came to the Tiber, where they crossed the Ponte della Rovere and made haste again towards their goal. The place Machiavelli's spy Bruno had indicated was a ramshackle villa just north of the Prati district market. But its crumbling stucco belied a brand-new iron-bound front door, and the grilles on the windows were new and freshly painted. Before Machiavelli could stop him, Ezio had gone up to the door and hammered on it. The Judas set into it, opened, and a beady eye regarded them. Then, to their amazement, the door swung smoothly back on well-oiled hinges. They found themselves in a nondescript courtyard where there was no one about. Whoever had opened the door, and closed it firmly behind them, had disappeared. There were doors on 3 sides of the yard. The one opposite the entrance was open, and above it was a tattered banner bearing a black bull in a golden field. "Trapped," said Machiavelli succinctly. "What weapons do you have?" Ezio had his trusty hidden blade, his sword, and his dagger. Machiavelli carried a light sword and a stiletto. "Come in, gentlemen. You're most welcome," said a disembodied voice from a window overlooking the courtyard somewhere high up in the wall above the open door. "I think we have something to trade with." "The Pope knows where we are," retorted Machiavelli loudly. "You are lost. Give yourselves up. The cause you serve is dead." A hollow laugh was his rejoinder. "Is it indeed? I think not. But come in. We knew you'd take the bait. Bruno has been working for us for a year now." "Bruno?" "Treachery runs in families, and dear Bruno's is no exception. All Bruno wanted was a little more cash than you were giving him. He's worth it. He managed to inveigle Claudia here in the hope of meeting one of the English cardinals. They sit on the fence, as the English always do, and Claudia hoped to swing him to your side and get a little information out of him. Unfortunately, Cardinal Shakeshaft met with a terrible accident. He was run over by a carriage and died on the spot. But your sister, Ezio, is still alive, just, and I'm sure she's longing to see you." "Calma," said Machiavelli as the 2 men looked at each other. Ezio's blood boiled. He'd spent a day trying to trace the diehards, only to be led straight to them. He dug his fingernails into his palms. "Where is she, bastardi?" he yelled. "Come in." Cautiously, the 2 assassins approached the dark entrance. There was a dimly lit hall in whose centre, on a plinth, was a bust of Pope Alexander VI by Adchignono, as Machiavelli guessed. The coarse features, the hooked nose, the weak chin, the fat lips, done to the life. There was no other furniture, and again there were 3 doors leading off the 3 walls facing the entrance. Only that facing the entrance was open. Ezio and Machiavelli made for it, and, passing through the door, found themselves in another bleak room. There was a table on which various rusty surgical instruments were arrayed on a stained cloth, glittering under the light of a single candle. Next to it was a chair, and on it Claudia was seated, half undressed and bound, her hands in her lap, her face and breasts bruised, a gag in her mouth. 3 men detached themselves from the shadows that obscured the back wall. Ezio and Machiavelli were aware of others too, men and women, behind them and on either side. Those they could see in the dim light wore the now grubby colours of the Borgia, and all were heavily armed. Claudia's eyes spoke to Ezio's. She managed to wrestle her branded finger free enough to show him. She had not given in despite the torture. She was a true assassin. Why had he ever doubted her? "We know how you feel about your family," said the chief diehard, a gaunt man of perhaps 50 summers whom Ezio did not recognise. "You let your father and brothers die. Your mother we need not bother about, as she's dying anyway. But you can still save your sister, if you wish. She's already well struck in years and doesn't even have any children, so perhaps you won't bother." Ezio controlled himself. "What do you want?" "In exchange, I want you to leave Rome. Why don't you go back to Monteriggioni and build the place up again? Do some farming. Leave the power game to those who understand it." Ezio spat. "Oh dear," said the thin man. He seized Claudia by the hair, and producing a small knife, cut her left breast. Claudia screamed. "She's damaged goods at the moment, but I'm sure she'll recover under your tender care." "I'll take her back, and then I'll kill you. Slowly." "Ezio Auditore, I gave you a chance, but you threatened me, and you're in no position to threaten. If there's any killing to be done, it will be by me. Forget Monteriggioni, a sophisticated lady like Madonna Claudia would doubtless hate it there anyway. Your destiny is here, to die in this room." The men and women on each side closed in, drawing swords. "I told you, we're trapped," said Machiavelli. "At least we've found the bastards," replied Ezio, as each man looked the other in the eye. "Here." He flung a handful of poisoned darts to his companion. "Make them work." "You didn't tell me you came prepared." "You didn't ask." "I did. Shut up." Ezio fell into a crouch as the diehards advanced. Their leader held the thin knife to Claudia's throat. "Let's go." As one, they drew their swords, and with their other hands they threw the poison darts with deathly aim. The Borgia supporters toppled on either side as Machiavelli closed in, slicing and slashing with his sword and dagger, pushing against the diehards who tried to crush him, in vain, by force of numbers. Ezio had one goal: to kill the thin man before he could rip open Claudia's throat. He leapt forward, seizing the man by the gizzard, but his adversary was as slippery as an eel and wrenched himself to one side without letting go of his victim. Ezio finally managed to wrestle him to the floor, and grasping his right hand in his left, forced the point of the thin knife the man was holding close to his own throat. Its point touched the jugular artery. "Have mercy," babbled the die-hard leader. "I served a cause I thought was true." "How much mercy would you have shown my sister?" asked Ezio. "You filth! You are finished." There was no need to release the hidden blade. "I told you it would be a slow death," said Ezio, drawing the knife down to the man's groin. "But I am going to be merciful." He slid the knife back up and sliced the man's throat open. Blood bubbled in the man's mouth. "Bastardo!" he gurgled. "You will die by Micheletto's hand." "Requiescat in pace," said Ezio, letting the man's head fall, though for once he spoke the words without much conviction. The other diehards lay dead or dying about them, as Machiavelli and Ezio hastened to untie the harsh cords that bound Claudia. She had been badly beaten, but the diehards had at least drawn a line at leaving her honour intact. "Oh, Ezio, are you all right?" "I hope so." "Come on. We must get out of here." "Gently." "Of course." Ezio took his sister in his arms, and followed by a sombre Machiavelli, walked out into the dying light of day. "Well," said Machiavelli, "at least we know for sure that Micheletto is still alive." Chapter 51. "We've found Micheletto," said La Volpe. "Where?" Ezio's voice was urgent. "He's holed up in Zagarolo, just to the east of here." "Let's get him, then." "Not so fast. He's got contingents from the Romagna towns still loyal to Cesare. He'll put up a fight," La Volpe warned. "Let him. We'll have to organise." "Then let's do it, now." Ezio, with Machiavelli and La Volpe, summoned a meeting on Tiber Island that night. Bartolomeo was still in Ostia, watching the port, and Claudia was resting up at the Rosa in Fiore, tended by her ailing mother after her terrible ordeal. There were enough thieves and recruits to muster a force of 100 men and women able to bear arms, and there was no need of other condottieri to back them up. "He's encamped in the old gladiatorial school, Ludus Magnus, and he's got maybe 250 men with him." "What does he intend to do?" Ezio wondered. "No idea. Break out, head for safety in the north with the French, who knows?" "Whatever his plans are, let's nip them in the bud." By early dawn, Ezio had gathered a mounted force. They rode out the short distance to Zagarolo and had surrounded Micheletto's encampment by sunrise. Ezio bore his crossbow on one arm, over the bracer, and on the other his poison blade. There would be no quarter taken, though he wanted to take Micheletto alive. The defenders put up a fierce fight, but in the end Ezio's forces were victorious, scattering the diehards under Micheletto's command like chaff. Among the wounded, dead, and dying, Micheletto stood proud, defiant to the last. "We take you, Micheletto da Correia, as our prisoner," said Machiavelli. "No more shall you infect our nation with your schemes." "Chains will never hold me," snarled Micheletto, "any more than they will hold my master." They took him in chains to Florence, where he took up residence in the cells of the Signoria, in the very cell where Ezio's father Giovanni had spent his last hours. There, the governor of the city, Piero Soderini, together with his friend and adviser Amerigo Vespucci and Machiavelli, interrogated and tortured him. But they could get nothing out of him, and so, for the moment, they left him to rot. His days as a killer seemed done. Ezio, for his part, returned to Rome. "I know you are a Florentine at heart, Niccolo," he told his friend at their parting, "but I shall miss you." "I am also an assassin," replied Machiavelli, "and my first loyalty will always be to the Brotherhood. Let me know when you next have need of me, and I will come to you without delay. Besides," he added darkly, "I haven't given up all hope of squeezing information out of that vile man." "I wish you luck," said Ezio. He wasn't so sure they'd break him. Micheletto might be an evil man, but he was also very strong-willed. Chapter 52. "Ezio, you must put Micheletto out of your mind," Leonardo told him, as they sat in the studio in Rome. "Rome is at peace. This Pope is strong. He has subdued the Romagna. He is a soldier as much as he is a man of God, and perhaps, under him, all Italy will find peace at last. And although Spain controls the south, Ferdinand and Isabella are our friends." Ezio knew that Leonardo was happy in his work. Pope Julius had employed him as a military engineer, and he was tinkering with a host of new projects, though he sometimes pined for his beloved Milan, which was still in French hands, and talked in his more depressed moments of going to Amboise, where he had been offered all the facilities he needed whenever he wanted them. He often talked of going once he had finished Pope Julius's commissions. As for the Romagna, Ezio's thoughts turned often to Caterina Sforza, whom he still loved. A letter he'd received from her told him that she was now involved with the Florentine ambassador. Ezio knew her life remained in turmoil, and that, despite Julius's support, she had been dismissed from Forli by her own people on account of the cruelty she had displayed when putting down the rebellion against her late, intractable second husband, Girolamo Feo, and that she was growing old in retirement now, in Florence. At first his letters to her were angry, then remonstrative, then pleading, but she replied to none of them, and finally he accepted that she had used him, and that he would never see her again. Thus it was with relationships between men and women. The lucky ones last, but too often when they end for good, and deep intimacy is replaced by a desert. Ezio was hurt and humiliated, but he didn't have time to wallow in his misery. His work in Rome consolidating the Brotherhood and above all holding it in readiness kept him busy. "I believe that as long as Micheletto lives, he will do his best to escape, free Cesare Borgia, and help him rebuild his forces," Ezio maintained. Leonardo had problems of his own regarding his feckless boyfriend Salai, and barely listened to his old friend. "No one has ever escaped from the prison in Florence," he said. "Not from those cells." "Why don't they kill him?" "They still think they might get something out of him, though personally I doubt it," said Leonardo. "In any case, the Borgia are finished. You should rest. Why don't you take your poor sister and return to Monteriggioni?" "She has grown to love Rome and would never return to such a small place now. And in any case, the Brotherhood's new home is here." This was another sadness in Ezio's life. After an illness, his mother, Maria, had died. Claudia, after her abduction at the hands of the Borgia diehards, had given up the Rosa in Fiore, and the brothel was now controlled by Julius's own network of spies, who used different girls. La Volpe had negotiated with his colleague Antonio in Venice to send Rosa, now older and statelier, but no less fiery than she had been when Ezio knew her in La Serenissima, to Rome to run it. There was also the problem of the apple. So much had changed, and when Ezio was summoned to the Vatican for an interview with the Pope, he was unprepared for what he would hear. "I'm intrigued by this device you've got," said Julius, coming, as always, straight to the point. "What do you mean, Your Holiness?" The Pope smiled. "Don't prevaricate with me, my dear Ezio. I have my own sources, and they tell me you have something you call the apple, which you found under the Sistine Chapel some years ago. It seems to have great power." Ezio's brain raced. How had Julius found out about the apple? Had Leonardo told him? Leonardo could be curiously innocent at times, and he had wanted a new patron very badly. "It was vouchsafed to me in a manner I find hard to explain to you, by a force from an antique world to help us. And it has, but I fear its potential. I cannot think that the hands of man are ready for such a thing, but it is known as a piece of Eden. There are other pieces, some lost to us, and others perhaps left hidden." "It sounds very useful. What does it do?" "It has the ability to control men's thoughts and desires. But that is not all. It is able to reveal things undreamed of." Julius pondered this. "It sounds as if it might be very useful to me. Very useful indeed. But it could also be used against me in the wrong hands. It is what the Borgia were misusing when they tried to gain total ascendancy. Luckily, Leonardo, to whom they gave it to research, kept its darkest secrets from them." The Pope paused once again in thought. "Then I think it better if we leave it in your care," he said at last. "If it was vouchsafed to you by such a power as you describe, it would be rash to take it away from you." He paused again. "It seems to me that when you feel you have no further use for it, you should hide it in a safe place, and maybe, if you wish, leave some kind of clue for any worthy successor, possibly a descendant of yours, who perhaps alone will be able to understand it, so that it may once more have a use in the world for future generations. For I do believe, Ezio Auditore, and perhaps I am being guided by God in this, that in our time no one but you should have custody of it. It may be that there is some unique quality, some sense, that enables you to withstand using it irresponsibly." Ezio bowed and said nothing, but in his heart he acknowledged Julius's wisdom, and he couldn't have agreed more with his judgment. "By the way," Julius said, "I don't care for Leonardo's boyfriend. What's his name? Salai? He seems very shifty to me, and I wouldn't trust him. It's a pity Leo seems to, for apart from that one little weakness, the man is a genius. Do you know, he's developing some kind of lightweight, bulletproof armor for me. I don't know where he gets his ideas from." Ezio thought of the codex brace Leonardo had recreated for him, and he smiled to himself. Well, why not? Now he could guess the source of the Pope's information about the apple, and he knew that Julius had revealed it deliberately. Fortunately, Salai was more of a fool than a knave, but he'd have to be watched all the same and, if necessary, removed. After all, he knew what the nickname Salai meant. Little Satan. Chapter 53. Ezio made his way back to Leonardo's studio soon after his audience with the Pope, but he failed to find Salai at home, and Leonardo was shamefaced about him. He had sent Salai into the country, and no amount of persuasion would get him to reveal where. This would have to be a problem for La Volpe and his thieves' guild to deal with. It was clear that Leonardo was embarrassed. Perhaps he would learn to keep his mouth shut in front of the boy in future, for he knew that Ezio could get Leonardo into a deal of trouble. Fortunately, Leonardo was still more of a help than a hindrance, and a good friend too, and Ezio made this very clear to him. But if there were any more breaches of security, well, no one was indispensable. Leonardo wanted to make it up to Ezio, though. "I've been thinking about Cesare," he said, with his usual eagerness. "Oh? In fact, I'm very glad you've come. I've found someone I think you should meet." "Does he know where Cesare is?" asked Ezio. If he did, thought Ezio, Micheletto would cease to matter. If he didn't, Ezio might even consider letting Micheletto escape from prison, for Ezio knew the Signoria well, and using the man to lead him to his master. It was a dangerous plan, he knew, but he wasn't going to use the apple except as a last resort. He found the burden of the piece of Eden increasingly disturbing, having had a series of strange dreams of countries and buildings and technology that couldn't possibly exist. Then he remembered the vision of the castle, the remote castle in a foreign land. That, at least, was a recognizable building of his own time. But where could it be? Leonardo brought him back from his musings. "I don't know if he knows where Cesare is, but he's called Gaspar Torreia, and he was Cesare's personal physician. He's got some ideas I think are interesting. Shall we go and see him?" "Any lead is a good one." Dottore Torreia received them in a spacious surgery on the Apennine, whose ceiling was hung with herbs, but also with strange creatures such as dried bats, the little corpses of desiccated toads, and even a small crocodile. Torreia was wizened and a little bent in the shoulders, but he was younger than he looked. His movements were quick, almost lizard-like, and the eyes behind his spectacles were bright. He was also another Spanish expatriate, but he was reputed to be brilliant, so Pope Julius had spared him. He was, after all, a scientist with no interest in politics. What he was interested in, and talked about at length, was the new disease. "You know, both my former master and his father Rodrigo had it. It's very ugly indeed in its final stages, and I believe it affects the mind, and may have left both Cesare and the former pope affected in the brain. Neither had any sense of proportion, and it may still be strong in Cesare, wherever they've put him." "Do you have any idea?" "My guess is somewhere as far away as possible, and in a place he could never escape from." Ezio sighed. So much was surely obvious. "I have called the disease the morbus gallicus, the French disease," Dr. Torreia plunged on enthusiastically. "Even the present pope has it in the early stages, and I'm treating him. It's an epidemic, of course. We think it came from Columbus's sailors, and probably Vespucci's too, about 7 or 8 years ago, when they brought it back from the New World." "Why call it the French disease, then?" asked Leonardo. "Well, I certainly don't want to insult the Italians, and the Portuguese and the Spanish are our friends, but it broke out first among French soldiers in Naples. It starts with lesions on the genitals, and it can deform the hands, the back, and the face, indeed the whole head. I'm treating it with mercury to be drunk or rubbed on the skin, but I don't think I've found a cure." "That is certainly interesting," said Ezio. "But will it kill Cesare?" "I don't know." "Then I must still find him." "Fascinating," said Leonardo, excited by yet another new discovery. "There is something else I've been working on," said Torreia, "which I think is even more interesting." "What is it?" asked his fellow scientist. "It's this, that people's memories can be passed down, preserved, from generation to generation in the bloodline, rather like some diseases. I like to think I'll find a cure for morbus gallicus, but I feel it may be with us for centuries." "What makes you say that?" said Ezio, strangely disturbed by the man's remark about memories being passed down through the generations. "Because I believe it's transmitted in the first instance, through sex, and we'd all die out if we had to do without that." Ezio grew impatient. "Thank you for your time," he said. "Don't mention it," replied Torreia. And by the way, if you really want to find my former master, I think you could do worse than look in Spain. In Spain? Where in Spain? The doctor spread his hands. I'm a Spaniard, so is Cesare. Why not send him home? It's just a hunch. I'm sorry I can't be more specific. Ezio thought it would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. But it may be a start. Chapter 54. Ezio no longer kept the location of his lodgings a total secret, but only a few knew where they were. One of them was Machiavelli. One night, Ezio was awoken by him at 4 in the morning when there was a deliberate, urgent knocking at the door. "Niccolo, what are you doing here?" Ezio was instantly alert, like a cat. "I've been a fool." "What happened? You were working in Florence. You can't be back so soon." Ezio already knew something grave must have happened. "I have been a fool," Machiavelli repeated. "What's going on?" "In my arrogance, I kept Micheletto alive," sighed Machiavelli. "In a secure cell, to question him." "You'd better tell me what's going on." "He has escaped on the eve of his execution." "From the Signoria? How?" "Over the roof. Borgia diehards climbed onto it during the night and killed the guards. Then they lowered a rope. The priest who gave him his last confession was a Borgia sympathizer. He's being burnt at the stake today, and he smuggled a file into his cell. Micheletto sawed through just one bar on the window. He's a big man, but it was enough for him to squeeze out and climb up. You know how strong he is. By the time the alarm was raised, he was nowhere to be found in the city. "We must seek him out, and—" Ezio paused, suddenly seeing an advantage in this adversity. "Having found him, see where he runs. He may yet lead us to Cesare. He is insanely loyal, and without Cesare's support, his own power is worthless. I have light cavalry scouring the countryside even now, trying to hunt him down. But there are plenty of small pockets of Borgia diehards, like those who rescued him, willing to shelter him. I think he's in Rome. That's why I've come here." "Why Rome?" "We have been too complacent. There are Borgia supporters here, too. He will use them to make for Ostia and try to board a ship there." "Bartolomeo is in Ostia. No one will escape him and his condottieri there. I'll send a rider to alert him." "But where will Micheletto go?" "Where else but Valencia, his hometown?" "Ezio, we must be sure. We must use the apple now, this minute, to see if we can locate him." Chapter 55. Ezio turned, and in the bedroom of his lodgings, out of sight of Machiavelli, he drew the apple from its secret hiding place. Carefully, he took it out of its container with gloved hands and placed it on the table in his bedroom. Then he concentrated. Very slowly, the apple began to glow, and then its light brightened until the room was filled with a cold illumination. Next, images, dim at first and indistinct, flickered onto the wall and resolved themselves into something it had shown Ezio before. It's a strange remote castle in a brown, barren landscape, very old, with a massive outer barbican, 4 main towers, and an impregnable-looking square keep at its centre, he explained to Machiavelli. "Where is that rocker?" "What is the apple telling us?" Machiavelli shouted from the other room. "It could be anywhere," Ezio muttered to himself. "From the landscape, Syria, perhaps?" "Or," he said, as with a sudden rush of excitement he remembered Dr. Torreya's words, "Spain!" he shouted to Machiavelli. "Spain!" "Micheletto can't be in Spain." "I am certain he plans to go there. Even so, we don't know where this place is. There are many, many castles in Spain, and many similar to this one. Consult the apple again." But when Ezio tried again, the image remained unchanged. A solidly built castle on a hill, a good 300 years old, surrounded by a little town. The image was monochrome, and all the houses, the fortress, and the countryside were an almost uniform brown. There was only one spot of colour, a bright flag on a pole on the very top of the keep. Ezio squinted at it. A white flag with a red ragged cross in the form of an X. His excitement mounted. The military standard of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. "You can see their standard," yelled Machiavelli from the other room, his voice contracting with excitement. "Good. Now we know what country. But we still don't know where it is, or why we're being shown it. Is Micheletto on his way there? Ask the apple again." The vision faded and was replaced by a fortified hill town, from whose fort flew a white flag criss-crossed with red chains, their links filled in yellow, which Ezio recognized as the flag of Navarre. Then there was a third and final picture, a massive, wealthy seaport with ships drawn up on a glittering sea and an army gathering, but no clue about the exact location of any of these places. Chapter 56. Everyone was in place. Couriers rode daily between the points where the Brotherhood had set up bases. Bartolomeo was beginning to enjoy Ostia, and Pantasilea loved it. Antonio de Majanis still held the fort in Venice. Claudia had returned for the time being to Florence to stay with her old friend Paola, who kept an expensive house of pleasure on which the Rosa in Fiore had been modelled, and La Volpe and Rosa watched over Rome. It was time for Machiavelli and Ezio to go hunting. Chapter 57. Leonardo was reluctant to let Ezio and Machiavelli enter his studio, but eventually he allowed them in. "Leo, we need your help," Ezio said, coming straight to the point. "You weren't very pleased with me last time we met. Salai shouldn't have told anyone about the apple. He got drunk in a wine booth and blurted it out to impress. Most of the people around him didn't know what he was talking about, but there was an agent of Pope Julius within earshot. He is very contrite." "Where is he now?" asked Ezio. Leonardo squared his shoulders. "If you want my help, I want payment." "What are you talking about? What kind of payment?" "I want you to leave him alone. He means a lot to me. He is young. With time he will improve." "He's a little sewer rat," said Machiavelli. "Do you want my help, or don't you?" Ezio and Machiavelli looked at each other. "All right, Leo, but keep him on a very close rein, or by God, we'll show no mercy next time." "All right. Now what do you want me to do?" "We're having problems with the apple. It isn't as acute as it was. Could there be something wrong with it mechanically?" asked Machiavelli. Leonardo stroked his beard. "You have it with you?" Ezio produced the box. "Here." He took it out and placed it carefully on Leonardo's work table. Leonardo examined it with equal care. "I don't really know what this thing is," he conceded finally. "It's dangerous, it's a mystery, and it's very, very powerful. And yet only Ezio seems able to control it. God knows when it was in my power in the old days under Cesare, I tried, but I only partially succeeded." He paused. "No, I don't think the word mechanical describes this thing. If I weren't more of a scientist than an artist, I'd say it had a mind of its own." Ezio remembered the voice that had come from the apple. What if Leonardo were right? "Micheletto is on the run," said Ezio urgently. "We need to locate him, and fast. We need to pick up his trail before it's too late." "What do you think he's planning?" "We're almost certain that Micheletto has decided to go to Spain to locate and liberate his master Cesare, and they will then attempt to return to power. We need to stop them," said Machiavelli. "And the apple?" "Shows an image of a castle. It must be somewhere in Spain because it flies the Spanish flag. But the apple doesn't, or won't, or can't give its location. We also saw an image of a town flying the Navarrese flag, and a seaport with an army gathering to embark there. But the apple gave us nothing on Micheletto at all." said Ezio. Well, said Leonardo, Cesare can't have jinxed it because no one's that clever, so it must, how can I put this, have decided not to be helpful. But why would it do that? Why don't we ask it? Ezio once again concentrated, and this time a most divine music, sweet and high, came to his ears. Can you hear it? He asked. Hear what? Replied the others. Through the music came the voice he had heard before. Ezio Auditore, you have done well, but I have more than played my part in your career, and you must now return me. Take me to a vault you will find under the Capitoline, and leave me there to be found by future members of your Brotherhood. But be quick. You must then ride post-haste to Naples, where Micheletto is embarking for Valencia. This knowledge is my last gift to you. You have more than enough power of your own to have no further need of me. I will lie in the ground until future generations have need of me, so you must leave a sign to indicate my burial place. Farewell, mentor of the Brotherhood. Farewell. Farewell. The apple ceased to glow, and looked dead, like an old leather-bound ball. Swiftly, Ezio told his friends what had been imparted to him. Naples? Why Naples? Leonardo asked. Because it's in Spanish territory, and we have no jurisdiction there. And because he knows, somehow, that Bartolomeo is policing Ostia, said Ezio. We must make all speed. Come. Dusk was falling as Machiavelli and Ezio carried the apple in its box down into the catacombs below the Colosseum, and, passing through the dreadful gloomy rooms of the remains of Nero's golden house, carried torches before them as they made their way through a maze of tunnels under the old Roman Forum to a spot near the church of San Nicola in Carcere. There they found a secret door within the crypt, and behind it was a small vaulted room in the centre of which stood a plinth. On this they placed the apple in its box, and withdrew. Once closed, as if by magic, the door ceased to be visible, even to them. But they knew where it was, and near it they drew the sacred secret symbols that only a member of the Brotherhood would understand. The same symbols they inscribed at regular intervals along their way back, and again at the mouth of the entrance near the Colosseum from which they emerged. After meeting Leonardo again, who had insisted on joining them, they rowed hard to Ostia, where they took a ship for the long coastal journey south to Naples. They arrived on Midsummer's Day 1505, Ezio's 46th birthday. They didn't go into the teeming, hilly town, but remained among the fortified docks, splitting up to search among the sailors, tradesmen and travellers busy about their fishing smacks, their shallops and their caravels, carracks and cogs, visiting the taverns and brothels, and all in frantic haste, for no one, Spanish, Italian or Arab, seemed to have an answer to their question. Have you seen a tall, thin man, with huge hands and scars on his face, seeking passage to Valencia? After an hour of this, they regrouped on the main quay. He's going to Valencia. He must be, said Ezio, through gritted teeth. But if he isn't, put in Leonardo, and we charter a ship and sail to Valencia anyway, we might lose days and even weeks, and so lose Micheletto altogether. You're right. The apple didn't lie to you. He was, or, if we're lucky, is here. We just have to find somebody who knows for sure. A horse sidled up, grinning. We're not interested, snapped Machiavelli. She was a pretty blonde woman of about 40 years of age, tall and slim, with dark brown eyes, long shapely legs, small breasts, broad shoulders and narrow hips. But you are interested in Micheletto da Correia? Ezio swung round on her. She looked so like Caterina that for a moment his head swam. What do you know? She snapped back with all the hardness of a whore. What's it worth to you? Then came the professional smile again. I'm Camilla, by the way. 10 ducats. 20, 20. You'd earn less than that in a week on your back, snarled Machiavelli. Charmer. Do you want the information or not? I could see you're in a hurry. 15 then, said Ezio, pulling out his purse. That's better, tesoro. Information first, said Machiavelli as Camilla held out her hand for the money. Half first. Ezio handed over 8 ducats. Generous with it, said the woman. All right. Micheletto was here last night. He spent it with me, and I've never earned my money harder. He was drunk, he abused me, and he ran off at dawn without paying. Pistol in his belt, sword, ugly-looking dagger. Smelt pretty bad too, but I know he had money because I guessed what he'd do and took my fee out of his purse when he finally fell asleep. Of course, the bouncers from the brothel followed him, though I think they were a little scared, so they kept their distance a bit. And, said Machiavelli, none of this is of any use to us so far. But they kept him in sight. He must have chartered a ship the night before because he went straight to a carrack called the Marea di Alba and sailed on the dawn tide. Describe him, said Ezio. Big, huge hands. I had them round my neck so I should know. Broken nose, scarred face. Some of the scars seemed to make him look like he had a permanent grin. He didn't talk much. How do you know his name? I asked, just to make conversation, and he told me, she answered simply. And where was he going? One of the bouncers knew one of the seamen, and asked him as they were casting off. Where? Valencia. Valencia. Micheletto was going back to his birthplace, which was also the hometown of a family called Borgia. Ezio handed her 7 more ducats. I'll remember you, he said. If we find you're lying, you'll regret it. It was already midday. It took them another hour to find a fast caravel available for charter and agree the price. Another 2 hours were needed to victual and prepare the ship. Then they had to wait for the next tide. A caravel is faster than a carrack, but even so, it was early evening before the sails were raised, and the sea was choppy and the wind against them. Happy birthday, said Leonardo to Ezio. Chapter 58. The fates were against them too. Their ship sailed well, but the sea remained rough, and they encountered squalls that took the sails aback. The hoped-for chance of catching up with Micheletto at sea was long gone when, 5 days later, their battered caravel put into port at Valencia. It was a prosperous and booming place, but none of the three, Ezio, Leonardo, or Machiavelli, were familiar with it. The recently built Silk Exchange vied in grandeur with the Bell Tower, the Torres de Quart, and the Palau de la Generalitat. It was then a powerful Catalan city, one of the most important trading ports in the Mediterranean Sea, but it was also confusing and teeming with Valencianos, who mingled in the busy streets with Italians, Dutch, English, and Arabs, creating a babel of languages in the streets. Fortunately, the Marea di Alba was moored near to where the caravel docked, and the 2 captains were friends. Ciao, Alberto. Ciao, Filin. Bad voyage? Said Alberto, a stout man of 30, as he stood on the poop deck of his vessel, supervising the loading of a mixed cargo of silk and rare, expensive coffee for the return journey. Brutissimo. So I see from the state of your ship. But there'll be a good sea and a fair wind for the next week, so I'm hurrying back as soon as I can. I won't be so lucky. When did you get in? 2 days ago. Ezio stepped up. And your passenger? Alberto spat. Che tipo brutto. But he paid well. Where is he now? Gone. I know he was in the town asking questions, but he's well known here and he has many friends, believe it or not. Alberto spat again. Not of the best sort, either. I'm beginning to wish I hadn't come, whispered Leonardo. One thing I am not is a man of violence. Where has he gone, do you know? He was staying at the Lobo Solitario. You could ask there. They disembarked and made straight for the Lone Wolf Inn, after Alberto had given them directions, and added, darkly, "It is not a place for gentlemen." "What makes you think we are gentlemen?" said Machiavelli. Alberto shrugged. Ezio scanned the busy quay. Out of the corner of his eye he saw 3 or 4 shady characters watching them, causing him to check his bracer and hidden blades. He slung his bag over his shoulder, leaving his arms free for his sword and dagger. Noticing this, Machiavelli did the same, while Leonardo looked askance. Together they made their way into the town, remaining on the alert even though the shady characters had disappeared. "Shall we stay at the same place as our quarry?" suggested Ezio. "It'll be the best place to be to find out where he is." The inn was located in a narrow street of tall tenements, which twisted away from one of the main thoroughfares. It was a low, dark building, in contrast to the sparkling newness of most of the rest of the town. The dark wooden door was open, giving onto a dark interior. Ezio entered first, Leonardo, reluctantly, last. They had reached the centre of the vestibule, in which furniture and a long, low counter could only just be made out, when the door behind them banged shut. The 10 men who had been lurking in the shadows, their eyes already accustomed to the dark, now pounced, flinging themselves on their victims with guttural cries. Ezio and Machiavelli immediately threw down their bags, and in one movement Machiavelli drew his sword and dagger and closed on his first assailant. The glint of blades flashed in the semi-darkness of the room, which was big enough for there to be plenty of space to move, helping both sides. "Leonardo," shouted Ezio, "get behind the counter and catch this!" He threw his sword to Leonardo, who caught it, dropped it, and picked it up again in the space of a second. Ezio unleashed the hidden blade as one of the men fell on him, stabbing him with it in the side and penetrating his guts. The man stumbled, clutching his belly, blood bubbling between his hands. Meanwhile, Machiavelli strode forward, holding his sword aloft. Quick as a flash, he thrust his sword into the throat of his first opponent, while simultaneously slicing into the groin of a second with his other blade. The man fell to the floor with an anguished roar, fumbling vainly at his wound while twitching with agony. Machiavelli closed in and glanced briefly at his victim, kicking out viciously and silencing the man in an instant. The assailants drew back for a moment, surprised that their ambush had not achieved its purpose, and at the alacrity of their intended victims. Then they renewed their attack with redoubled vigour. There was a cry from Machiavelli as he was cut in his sword arm from behind, but in a moment Ezio was upon his friend's assailant, plugging his dagger straight into the man's face. The next thing Ezio knew, a big man who smelt of prison straw and stale sweat crept up behind him and threw a garrote around his neck. Ezio choked and dropped his dagger, raising his hand to tear at the rope being tightened on his windpipe. Machiavelli leapt over and stabbed at the big man, cutting into him and causing him to cry out in sudden pain. But Machiavelli had missed his mark, and the man was able to thrust him away. It was enough to make him lose his grip on the garrote, though, so that Ezio was able to spring free. The light was too dim to make out the black-cloaked forms of the surviving attackers, but the failure of their immediate assault seemed to have unnerved them. "Get them," an unpleasant guttural voice said. "We are still 5 against 3. "Sancho dieron en el pecho," shouted another, as Ezio smashed his heavy dagger into the sternum of one flabby creature, splitting it as neatly as if it were a chicken breast. "We are 4 against 3. Nos replegamos." "No," ordered the first man who had spoken. "Aguantels mentres que me escape." The man spoke in Catalan. The big man who had tried to strangle him. The man who still had the stink of prison clinging to him. Micheletto. Moments later the door to the street was flung open and slammed shut again as Micheletto made his escape, momentarily silhouetted in the streetlight. Ezio rushed after him, but his path was blocked by one of the 3 surviving attackers, who was holding a scimitar aloft, ready to bring it down on his head. Ezio was too close to wield either of his weapons effectively, so he threw himself to the side, out of the way. As he rolled to safety, the scimitar came swinging down, but the man had struck so violently, expecting the sword's path to be interrupted by a body, that it continued its trajectory, burying itself in the man's genitals. With a howl, he dropped the sword and fell to the ground, clutching his manhood in an attempt to stop the fountaining blood, and writhing in agony. The last two men struggled with each other to reach the door in order to escape, and one succeeded, but the second, already wounded in the fight, was tripped by Machiavelli and crashed to the ground as Leonardo threw himself across him to prevent his rising. When it became clear he would not, Leonardo stood clear, and Ezio knelt and turned him over, pressing the point of the hidden blade into his nostril. "I am Ezio Auditore, mentor of the assassins," he said. "Tell me where your master is bound, and I will show you mercy." "Never," croaked the man. Ezio pressed the point of the blade in further, its razor-sharp edges slowly beginning to slit the man's nose. "Tell me." "All right. He's going to the Castillo della Mota." "What is there?" "That is where Cesare is held prisoner." Ezio pushed the blade. "Have mercy. I speak the truth. But you will never succeed in thwarting us. The Borgia will return to power and rule all Italy with an iron fist. They will swarm into the south and throw the filthy Spanish monarchy out, and then they will destroy the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile and rule them too." "How do you know where Cesare is?" "It is a dark secret known only to Pope Julius and his council, and to King Ferdinand and his." "Do you not think we have spies of our own, even in the Vatican? They're good, these spies. This time better than yours." With a sudden movement, the man brought up his right arm. In it was a small knife, which he aimed at Ezio's heart. Ezio just had time to block the blow with his left arm, and the knife skeeted harmlessly off his bracer and onto the floor. "Long live the royal house of Borgia!" the man cried. "Requiescat in pace," said Ezio. "Welcome to Valencia," Leonardo muttered. Chapter 59. The Lone Wolf Inn was deserted, but there were beds of a sort, and as it was late by the time Ezio and his companions had recovered from the bloody tussle with Micheletto's diehards, they had no choice but to spend the night there. They found wine, water, and food, bread, onions, and some salami, and even Leonardo was too hungry to refuse it. The following morning, Ezio rose early, eager to find horses for the journey ahead. Their ship's captain, Filin, was at the docks seeing to the refitting of his battered ship. He knew of the remote castle of La Mota, and gave them directions as far as he could as to how to find it, but it would be a long and arduous journey of many days. Filin also helped organize their horses, but preparations still took another 48 hours, since they had to provision themselves well. The journey would take them northwest across the brown sierras of central Spain. There were no maps, so they travelled from one town or village to another, using the list of names Filin had given them. They passed out of Valencia, and after several days' hard riding on their first set of horses, Leonardo complaining bitterly, they entered the beautiful mountain country around the tiny hill town of Cuenca. Then down again onto the flat plain of Madrid, and through the royal city itself, where the bandits who tried to rob them soon found themselves dead on the road. From there they went north to Segovia, which is dominated by its Alcazar, where they spent the night as the guests of the seneschal of Queen Isabella of Castile. They continued on through open country, where they were attacked and almost robbed by a gang of Moorish highwaymen, who had somehow slipped through the fingers of King Ferdinand and survived in open country for 12 years. Ferdinand, King of Aragon, Sicily, Naples, and Valencia, was founder of the Spanish Inquisition and scourge of the Jews, with dire consequences for his nation's economy, through his Grand Inquisitor Tomás de Torquemada. But through marriage to his equally ugly wife, Isabella, he had united Aragon and Castile and begun the road to making Spain a single nation. Ferdinand had ambitions on Navarre, too, though Ezio wondered how far the bigoted king's designs would have an impact on that country, where Cesare had such close family ties, being the brother-in-law of its French king. Fighting weariness, they rode on, praying that they would be in time to thwart Micheletto's plan. But despite all the haste they had made, he had had a good start on them. Chapter 60. Micheletto and his small band of diehards reined in their horses and stood up in their stirrups to look at the castle of La Motta. It dominated the small town of Medina del Campo, and had been built to protect it from the Moors. Micheletto had good eyesight, and even from that distance he could see the red scarf that Cesare had hung from his cell window. It was the topmost window in the central tower, and there was no need for bars because no one had ever escaped from La Motta. You could see why. The walls had been crafted by skilled 11th-century masons, and the stone blocks were so skillfully laid that the surface was as smooth as glass. It was good that they had devised this plan using the red scarf. Otherwise it might have been hard for Micheletto to find his master. The go-between, a La Motta sergeant of the guard, who'd been recruited to the Borgia cause in Valencia some time earlier, was perfect, and, once bribed, he had proved totally dependable. Getting Cesare out was going to be difficult, though. His cell door was permanently watched by 2 Swiss guards from a troop on loan from Pope Julius, all of whom were totally inflexible and incorruptible. So getting Cesare out the easy way was impossible. Micheletto measured the height of the central tower with his eyes. Once inside the place, they'd have to scale an impossible wall to a cell 150 feet up. So, that was out. Micheletto considered the problem. He was a practical man, but his speciality was killing, not problem-solving, and his thoughts led him to reflect on the main tool of his trade: rope. "Let's ride a little closer," he said to his companions. They'd all dressed in hunting outfits rather than their customary black, in order to arouse little or no suspicion. He had 10 men with him, and each of them carried, as part of their standard equipment, a length of rope. "We don't want to get too close," said his lieutenant, "or the guards on the ramparts will see us." "And what will they see? A hunting party coming to Medina to re-victual." "Don't worry, Girolamo." The remark gave Micheletto the germ of an idea, and he continued, "We'll ride right up to the town." It was about half an hour's ride, during which Micheletto was more than usually silent, his battered brow deeply furrowed. Then, as they approached the walls of the city, his face cleared. "Rein in," he said. They did so, and Micheletto looked them over. The youngest, a man of 18 called Luca, had no hair on his chin and a tip-tilted nose. He was already a hardened killer, but his face had the innocence of a cherub. "Get out your ropes and measure them." They obeyed. Each rope measured 12 feet, 120 feet when tied securely together. Add Micheletto's own and you had 130 feet. Cesare would have to drop the last 10 feet or so, but that would be nothing to him. The next problem was getting the rope to Cesare. For that, they'd have to contact their recruit, the sergeant of the guard, Juan, which wouldn't be too hard, as they knew Juan's movements and hours of duty. That would be Luca's job, since, as an innocent-looking young man, he'd attract the least attention. The rest of his band, though dressed like hunters, looked like the men they were: hardened thugs. Juan's palm would have to be greased, but Micheletto always carried a contingency fund of 250 ducats, and 1/10 of that should do it, for the whole job. Juan could gain access to Cesare's cell and deliver the rope. The Swiss guards wouldn't suspect him. Micheletto might even fake a letter with an official-looking seal on it to be delivered to Cesare as cover. The outer barbican was massive, though, and once Cesare was at the foot of the central tower, he'd have to cross the inner courtyards and get out, somehow, through the only gate. The one good thing was that La Motta's main function these days was to guard its single prisoner. Its original purpose had been to ward off attacks from the Moors, but that threat had long since been removed, and the massive place was, in every sense other than guarding Cesare, redundant. so he knew from Juan that it was a fairly cushy posting. They'd have to take a change of clothes to Cesare from time to time, so Micheletto thought through the possibilities of Juan organising delivery of a change of clothes for Cesare, a disguise to fool the guards. Then maybe it might work. He could think of no other way, apart from fighting their way in and getting Cesare out by force. "Luca," he said finally, "I have a job for you." It turned out that Juan wanted 50 ducats for the whole job, and Micheletto beat him down to 40, though he didn't waste time with too much bartering. It took Luca 3 trips to and fro to set the whole thing up, but finally he reported back. "It's arranged. He's going to take the rope and a guard's uniform to Cesare when he accompanies the man who takes him his evening meal at 6 o'clock. The postern gate will be guarded by Juan, who's going to take the midnight to 6 gate watch. It's a 5-minute walk from the castle to the town." Cesare Borgia's left leg hurt from the lesions of the new disease, but not much, just a dull ache that made him limp slightly. At 2 a.m., once he had changed into the guard's uniform, he tied one end of the rope firmly to the central mullion of the window of his cell and carefully lowered the rest out into the night. When it was all paid out, he slung his good leg over the windowsill, hauled the other one after it, and took a firm grip on the rope. Sweating, despite the coolness of the night, he descended hand over hand until his ankles felt the end of the rope. He dropped the last 10 feet, feeling the pain in his left leg when he landed, but he shook it off and limped across the deserted inner courtyard and through the outer one, where the sleepy guards paid him no attention, thinking him one of their own. At the gate he was challenged, at which point his heart went to his mouth. But then Juan came to his rescue. "It's all right. I'll take him to the guardhouse." What was going on? So near and yet so far. "Don't worry," said Juan under his breath. The guardhouse was occupied by 2 sleeping guards. Juan kicked one of them into life. "Wake up, Domingo. This man has a warrant for town. They forgot to order more straw for the stables, and they need some before they ride out on the dawn patrol. Take him back to the gate, explain to the guards there, and let him out." "Yes, sir." Cesare followed the guard out through the postern, which was then firmly locked behind him, and limped through the moonlight into the town. What joy to feel the cool night air around him after so long. He'd been confined in this dump since 1504, but he was free now. He was still only 30. He'd get it all back, and he'd take such vengeance on his enemies, especially the assassin Brotherhood, that he'd make Caterina Sforza's purges at Forli make her look like a nursemaid. He heard and smelt the horses at the appointed rendezvous. Thank God for Micheletto. Then he saw them. They were all there, in the shadows of the church wall. They had a fine black beast ready for him. Micheletto dismounted and helped him into the saddle. "Welcome back, Excellenza," he said. "And now we must hurry. That bastard assassino Ezio Auditore is on our heels." Cesare was silent. He was thinking about the slowest death he could devise for the assassin. "I've put matters in hand already at Valencia," continued Micheletto. "Good." They rode off into the night, heading southeast. Chapter 61. He's escaped! Ezio had ridden the last miles to La Mota without sparing himself, his companions, or their horses, but with an ever-deepening sense of apprehension. After more than 2 years. How? "It was carefully planned, signore," said the hapless lieutenant of the castle, a plumpish man of 60 with a very red nose. "We are holding an official inquiry." "And what have you come up with?" "As yet—" But Ezio wasn't listening. He was looking around at the castle of La Mota. It was exactly as the apple had depicted it, and the thought led him to remember another vision it had vouchsafed him, the gathering army at a seaport. The seaport had been Valencia. His mind raced frantically. He could think only of getting back to the coast as fast as possible, "Get me fresh horses," he yelled. "But, Signore—" Machiavelli and Leonardo looked at each other. "Ezio, whatever the urgency, we must rest, at least for a day," said Machiavelli. "A week," groaned Leonardo. As matters turned out, they were delayed because Leonardo fell ill. He was exhausted and missed Italy badly. Ezio was almost tempted to abandon him, but Machiavelli counselled restraint. "He is your old friend, and they cannot gather an army and a fleet in under 2 months." Ezio relented. Events were to prove him right, and to prove Leonardo invaluable. Chapter 62. Ezio and his companions were back in Valencia within a month, where they found the city in a state of uproar. Machiavelli had underestimated the speed with which things could happen in such a wealthy town. Men had been secretly mustering, and now, just outside Valencia, there was a huge camp of soldiers, maybe 1,000 men. The Borgia were offering mercenaries good wages, and word had got round fast. Budding soldiers were coming in from as far away as Barcelona and Madrid, and from all over the provinces of Murcia and La Mancha. Borgia money ensured that a fleet of perhaps 15 ships, quickly run-up troop ships with half a dozen small warships to protect them, was in the process of being built. "Well, we don't need the apple to tell us what our old friend Cesare is planning," said Machiavelli. "That's true. He doesn't need a vast army to take Naples, and once he's established a bridgehead there, he'll recruit many more men to his cause. His plan is to conquer the kingdom of Naples and then all Italy." "What are Ferdinand and Isabella doing about this?" asked Machiavelli. "They'll be getting a force together to crush it, so we'll enlist their aid." "It will take too long. Their army has to march from Madrid. The garrison here must have been put out of action. But you can see that Cesare is in a hurry," rejoined Machiavelli. "It might not even be necessary," mused Leonardo. "What do you mean?" "Bombs." "Bombs?" asked Machiavelli. "Quite little bombs, but effective enough to, say, wreck ships or disperse a camp." "Well, if they'll do that for us," said Ezio. "What do you need to make them?" "Sulphur, charcoal, and potassium nitrate. And steel, thinnish steel, flexible. And I'll need a small studio and a furnace." It took them a while, but fortunately for them, Captain Alberto's ship, the Maria di Alba, was tied up at its usual quay. He greeted them with a friendly wave. "Hello again," he said. "Those people I told you about, the ones who aren't gentlemen. I don't suppose you heard about the fracas at the Lone Wolf shortly after you arrived?" Ezio smiled and told him what they needed. "I know a man here who might be able to help you." "When do you return to Italy?" asked Leonardo. "I've brought over a cargo of grappa, and I'm taking back silk again. Maybe 2-3 days. Why?" "I'll tell you later." "Can you get what we need arranged quickly?" asked Ezio, who had a sudden sense of foreboding, though he couldn't blame Leonardo for wanting to leave. "Certainly." Alberto was as good as his word, and within a few hours everything had been arranged and Leonardo settled down to work. "How long will it take you?" asked Machiavelli. 2 days, since I don't have any assistants. I've enough material here to make 20, maybe 21 bombs. That's 10 each." "7 each," said Ezio. "No, my friend. 10 each. 1 lot for you and 1 for Niccolo here. You can count me out." 2 days later the bombs were ready. They were about the shape and size of a grapefruit, encased in steel, and fitted with a catch at the top. "How do they work?" Leonardo smiled proudly. "You flip this little catch. Actually, it's more of a lever. You count to 3, then you throw them at your target. Each of these is enough to kill 20 men, and if you hit a ship in the right place, to disable it completely, perhaps even sink it." He paused for a moment. "It's a pity there isn't time to build a submarine." "A what?" "Never mind. Just throw it after a count of 3. Don't hold on to it any longer, or you'll be blown to pieces yourself. He rose. "And now, goodbye and good luck." "What?" Leonardo smiled ruefully. "I've had quite enough of Spain, so I've booked a passage with Alberto. He sails on this afternoon's tide. I'll see you back in Rome, if you make it." Ezio and Machiavelli looked at one another, then solemnly embraced Leonardo. "Thank you, my dear friend," said Ezio. "Don't mention it." "Thank God you didn't build these things for Cesare," said Machiavelli. After Leonardo had gone, they carefully packed the bombs, there were exactly 10 each, into linen bags, which they slung over their shoulders. "You take the mercenaries' encampment, I'll take the port," said Ezio. Machiavelli nodded grimly. "When we've done the job, we'll meet at the corner of the street where the Lone Wolf is," said Ezio. "I reckon the Lone Wolf is where Cesare will have his centre of operations. Once the chaos has started, he'll go there to regroup with his inner circle. We'll try to corner them before they can make their escape, again." "For once I'll back your hunch," grinned Machiavelli. "Cesare is so vainglorious he won't have thought to change the Borgia diehard's hideout, and it's more discreet than a palazzo. Good luck, friend. We'll both need it." They shook hands and parted to go on their separate missions. Ezio decided to head for the troop ships first. Blending in with the crowd, he made his way down to the port, and once on the quay, selected his first target. He took out the first bomb, fighting down the insidious doubt that it might not work, and, aware that he'd have to be fast, flipped its catch, counted to 3, and flung it. He was working at close range, and his aim had deadly accuracy. The bomb landed with a clatter in the belly of the ship. For a few moments nothing happened, and Ezio cursed inwardly. What if the plan failed? But then there was an almighty explosion. The ship's mast cracked and fell, and splintered wood was tossed high in the air. Amid the chaos that followed, Ezio darted along the quay, selecting another ship and throwing the next bomb. In several cases, the first explosion was followed by a mightier one, as some of the troop ships had already been laden with casks of gunpowder. In one case, an exploding ship carrying gunpowder destroyed its 2 neighbours. One by one, Ezio wrecked 12 ships, but the chaos and panic that ensued were of equal value. In the distance, he could hear explosions, shouts, and screams, as Machiavelli did his work too. As Ezio made his way to their rendezvous, he hoped his friend had survived. All Valencia was in uproar, but pushing his way against the flow of the crowd, Ezio made the appointed meeting place in 10 minutes. Machiavelli wasn't there, but Ezio didn't have long to wait. Looking a bit shabby and with a blackened face, his fellow assassin soon came running up. "May God reward Leonardo da Vinci," he said. "Success?" "I've never seen such pandemonium," replied Machiavelli. "The survivors are running away out of town as fast as they can. I think most of them will prefer the plough to the sword after this." "Good. But we still have work to do." They made their way down the narrow street and arrived at the door of the Lone Wolf to find it closed. Silently as cats, they climbed onto the roof. It was a 1-story building, bigger than it appeared from the front, and near the top of the pitched roof there was an open skylight. They approached it and cautiously looked over the edge. It was a different room from the one in which they had been ambushed, with 2 men down below. Micheletto stood at a table, and facing him, seated, was Cesare Borgia. His once handsome face, now lacerated by the new disease, was white with fury. "They have destroyed my plans. Those damned assassins! Why did you not destroy them? Why did you fail me?" "Excellenza, Micheletto looked like a whipped dog. "I must make good my escape. I'll go to Viana in Navarre, just across the border. Let them try to recapture me then. I'm not waiting here for Ferdinand's men to come and haul me back to La Motta. My brother-in-law is King of Navarre, and he will surely help me." "I will help you, as I have always helped you. Only let me come with you." Cesare's cruel lips curled. "You got me out of La Motta, sure, and you built up my hopes.
But now look where you've got me.
Master, all my men are dead. I have done what I could.
And failed.
Micheletto went white. Is this my reward? For all my years of faithful service?
You dog! Get out of my sight! I discard you! Go and find some gutter to die in.
With a cry of rage, Micheletto hurled himself at Cesare. His huge, strangler's hands flexed to close on his former master's throat. But they never got there. With lightning speed, Cesare whipped out one of the 2 pistols he had in his belt and fired at point-blank range. Micheletto's face was destroyed beyond all recognition. The rest of his body crashed over the table. Cesare sprang back out of his chair to avoid being covered in blood. Ezio had drawn back so as to be invisible but not out of earshot, and was preparing to leap from the roof and grab Cesare as he came out of the front door of the inn. But Machiavelli had craned forward to get a better view of the dreadful showdown, and now he inadvertently kicked a tile loose, alerting Cesare. Cesare looked up swiftly and drew his second pistol. Machiavelli didn't have time to draw back before Cesare fired, shooting him through the shoulder and smashing his collarbone before he fled. Ezio thought of pursuit, but only for an instant. He had heard Cesare say that he intended to go to Viana, and he would follow him there, but not before he had seen to his wounded friend. Machiavelli groaned apologies of all things, as Ezio managed to haul him off the roof. At least he could walk, though the wound was bad. Once they reached the main thoroughfare, Ezio accosted a passer-by, having to stop the man by force as the chaos raged around them. "I need a doctor," he said urgently. "Where can I find one?" "Many people need a doctor," replied the man. Ezio shook him. "My friend is badly wounded. Where can I find a doctor? Now!" "Let go of me." "You could try El Medico Acosta. His rooms are just down the street. There's a sign outside." Ezio grabbed the near-fainting Machiavelli and supported him. He took his scarf from his tunic, and with it staunched the wound as best he could. Niccolo was losing a lot of blood. The minute he saw the wound, Acosta had Machiavelli sit in a chair. He took a bottle of alcohol and some swabs, and carefully dressed it. "The ball went right through the shoulder," he explained in broken Italian. "So at least I won't have to dig it out, and it's a clean wound. But as for the collarbone, I'll have to reset it. I hope you're not planning on travelling at any time soon." Ezio and Machiavelli exchanged a glance. "I have been a fool again," said Machiavelli, forcing a grin. "Shut up, Niccolo. Go on, get after him. I'll manage." "He can't stay here with me. I have a small annex that needs a patient," said Acosta, "and when he's healed, I'll send him after you." "How long?" "Perhaps 2 weeks, maybe more." "I'll see you in Rome," said Machiavelli. "All right," replied Ezio. "Take care of yourself, my friend." "Kill him for me," said Machiavelli, though at least he spared us the trouble of Micheletto. Part 3. We have reached the last era in prophetic song. Time has conceived, and the great sequence of the ages starts afresh. Justice, the Virgin, comes back to dwell with us, and the rule of Saturn is restored. The firstborn of the new age is already on his way from high heaven down to earth. Virgil, Eclogues 4. Chapter 63. Ezio once again travelled across Spain on a long and lonely journey, almost due north to Viana. He arrived there in the month of March in the year of our Lord 1507. The city that he saw, a mile or so distant, looked exactly like the one in the vision accorded him by the apple, with strong walls and a well-fortified citadel at its centre. But there was a difference. Even before he crossed the border into Navarre, Ezio's practiced eyes told him the city was under siege. When he came to a village, most of the locals just shook their heads dumbly when questioned, but when he sought out the priest with whom he was able to converse in Latin, he learned the whole picture.
You may know that our king and queen have designs on Navarre. It's a rich land and they want to incorporate it into Spain.
So they want to take Viana?
They've already taken it. It's occupied by the Count of Lerin on their behalf.
And the besiegers?
They are Navarrese forces. I think they will be the victors.
What makes you say that?
Because they are under the command of the brother-in-law of the King of Navarre, and he is an experienced general.
Ezio's heart beat faster, but he still needed confirmation. His name?
He's very famous, apparently. The Duke of Valence, Cesare Borgia. They say he once commanded the army of the Pope himself. But the Spanish troops are brave. They have taken the fight out to the enemy, and there have been bloody battles in the fields outside the town. I would not go any further in that direction, my son. There lies only devastation and blood.
Ezio thanked him and spurred his horse forward. He arrived at the scene to find a pitched battle going on right in front of him, while a fog swirled around them. In its midst, Cesare Borgia took a stand, hacking down any foe who came at him. Suddenly, Ezio himself had to fight another horseman, a Navarrese with his crest bearing a red shield crisscrossed with yellow chains. Ezio slashed at the man with his sword, but his foe ducked just in time to miss the blade, and Ezio nearly toppled over from the momentum. Recovering just in time, Ezio manoeuvred his horse round and back towards the man. The horseman was pulling his sword arm back to strike a blow at Ezio's open flank, but Ezio lunged at him with a lightning flick of his sword arm. The tip of his sword slashed into the man's chest, and he pulled back in pain, allowing Ezio to deliver a mighty blow downwards, splitting his foe's right shoulder down to his chest. He fell without a cry, and was finished off by the Spanish infantryman. Cesare was on foot, and Ezio decided that it would be easier to get close to him undetected if he were also on foot, so he dismounted and ran through the fray towards him. At last he stood face to face with his deadly foe. Cesare's face was streaked with blood and dust, and strained with exertion. But when he saw Ezio, his expression took on a new determination.
"Assassin! How did you find me?"
"My thirst to avenge Mario Auditore led me to you." They sliced at each other with their swords until Ezio managed to knock Cesare's weapon out of his hand. Then, sheathing his own, he flung himself on the Borgia, putting his hands around his throat. Cesare had learnt a few things from Micheletto about the art of strangling, though, and he managed to free himself by thrusting Ezio's arms away. Ezio unleashed the hidden blade, but Cesare caught the blow, once again successfully defending himself as the battle raged about them. It was then that the Spanish trumpets sounded the retreat. Triumphant, Cesare yelled to the nearest Navarrese troops,
"Kill him! Kill the assassin! Tear the maldito bastardo into pieces!"
As the fog increased, so Cesare melted into it, and the Navarrese soldiers closed in on Ezio. He fought them off long and hard before exhaustion overwhelmed him. Then he fell to the ground almost unnoticed as the melee and fog swirled around him, and the soldiers left him for dead. When Ezio came to, some time later, he was lying on his back in the middle of the battlefield. He had to push a corpse off him before he could sit up. The battlefield lay under a cloudy, blood-red sky, and in the distance the sun burned angrily. Dust hung in the air over a wide, unmade road, littered with the dead. Ezio saw a crow standing on a corpse's chin, pecking hungrily at its eye. A riderless horse stampeded by, driven mad by the smell of blood. Broken banners snapped in the breeze. Groaning with the effort, he stood up and, painfully at first, walked through the field of dead. He found that he had lost his sword and dagger, though the hidden blade and the bracer had not been found and looted. His first job was to replace his weapons. Near him, he noticed a peasant sifting through the spoils of battle. The peasant looked at him. "Help yourself," he said. "There's more than enough to go round." Ezio looked for fallen officers and knights, as they would be better armed, but in every case, someone had got there before him. At last he found a dead captain with a fine sword and a dagger similar to his own. These he took gratefully. Next he went in search of a horse, as it would be quicker to get around that way. He was in luck. Not half a mile from the edge of the battlefield, well away from the Navarrese camp, he came across a fully saddled and bridled war-horse, its back blood-stained, but not with its own blood, grazing in a green field. Talking to it gently, he mounted it. It kicked a little at first, but he soothed it quickly, then rode it back the way he had come. Back on the battlefield, he encountered more peasants recovering what they could from the bodies. He passed them and galloped uphill towards the sound of another fight. The crest of the hill revealed a level plain below it, where the battle had been rejoined close to the battlemented walls of the town, from where cannon fire issued. Chapter 64. Ezio steered his horse to one side of the battle, through some olive groves, where he encountered a patrol of Navarrese troops. Before he had time to turn round, they had fired their muskets at him, missing him, but cutting his horse down from under him. He managed to escape amongst the trees and continued on foot, taking care to avoid the Spanish troops, who were prowling everywhere. Creeping closer, he came to a clearing in which he saw one Spanish soldier lying wounded on the ground, while another did his best to comfort him. "Por favor," said the wounded man. "My legs. Why won't the bleeding stop?" "Compadre, I have done all I can for you. Now you must trust in God." "Oh, Pablo, I'm afraid. Mis piernas, mis piernas." "Quiet now, Miguel. Think of all the money we'll get when we won the battle. And the booty." "Who is this old man we're fighting for?" "Who? El Conde de Lerin?" "Yes. We're fighting for him, aren't we?" "Yes, my friend. He serves our king and queen, and we serve him, so we fight." "Pablo, the only thing I'm fighting for now is my life." A patrol arrived on the other side of the clearing. "Keep moving," said its sergeant. "We must outflank them." "My friend is wounded," said Pablo. "He cannot move." "Then leave him. Come on." "Give me a few more minutes." "Very well. We head north. Follow us, and be sure no Navarrese sees you." "Will we know when we have outflanked them?" "There will be gunfire. We'll cut them down where they least expect it. Use the trees for cover." "Just a moment, sir." "What is it?" "I will follow now." "Immediately?" "Yes, sir. My comrade Miguel is dead." Once they had gone, Ezio waited for a few minutes, then made his way north before veering east, in the direction he knew Viana lay. He left the olive groves and saw that he had passed the field of battle and was skirting it on its northern side. He wondered what had become of the Spanish soldiers, for there was no sign of any successful outflanking movement, and the battle seemed to be going to the Navarrese. On his way lay a shattered village. He avoided it, as he could see Spanish snipers concealed behind some of the charred and broken walls, using long-muzzled wheel-locks to fire on any Navarrese troops at the edge of the battle. He came across a soldier, his tunic so blood-stained that Ezio could not tell what side he was on, sitting with his back to a stray olive tree, and hugging himself in agony, his whole body shaking, his gun abandoned on the ground. Reaching the outskirts of the town, among the settlements that crouched beneath its bastions, Ezio finally saw his quarry ahead of him. Cesare was with a Navarrese sergeant, and was clearly assessing the best way of breaching or undermining Viana's massive walls. The Spanish, who had taken Viana, had been confident enough to allow some of their camp followers to settle in the houses here, but they were evidently not powerful enough to protect them now.
Suddenly, a woman came out of one of the cottages and ran towards them, screaming and blocking their path. "Aiutami!" she cried. "Help me! My son is wounded!" The sergeant went up to the woman and, seizing her by the hair, dragged her out of Cesare's way. "Aiutami!" she yelled. "Shut her up, will you?" said Cesare, surveying her coldly. The sergeant drew his dagger and slit the woman's throat. Chapter 65. As Ezio shadowed Cesare, he witnessed further scenes of brutality doled out by the Navarrese troops on the hated Spanish interlopers. He saw a young woman being roughly manhandled by a Navarrese trooper. "Leave me in peace!" she cried. "Be a good girl," the soldier told her brutally. "I will not hurt you. In fact, you might even enjoy it, you Spanish whore." Further along, a man, a cook by the look of him, stood in despair as two soldiers held him and forced him to watch two others set fire to his house. Worse still was a man, doubtless a wounded Spanish soldier who had had his legs amputated, being kicked out of his cart by a pair of Navarrese squaddies. They stood there laughing as he desperately tried to drag himself away from them along a footpath. "Run! Run!" said one. "Can't you go any faster?" added his comrade. The battle had obviously gone to the Navarrese, because Ezio could see them bringing siege towers up to the walls of the city. Navarrese troops were swarming up them, and there was fierce fighting on the battlements already. If Cesare were anywhere, it would be at the head of his men, for he was as ferocious and fearless as he was cruel. Somewhere behind him, a Spanish preacher intoned to a despairing congregation, "You have brought this on yourselves through sin. This is how the Lord punishes you. Ours is a just God, and this is his justice. Praise the Lord! Thank you, God, for teaching us to be humble, to see our punishment for what it is, a call to spirituality. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. So is the truth written. Amen." The only way into the city is up one of those towers, thought Ezio. The one nearest him had just been pushed up to the wall, and running, Ezio joined the men rushing up it, blending in with them, though there was scarcely any need, for amidst all the roaring and bellowing of the pumped-up besiegers, who scented victory at last, he would not have been noticed. The defenders were ready for them now, though, and began pouring the mixture of pitch and oil they call Greek fire down onto the enemy below. The screams of burning men came up to those already on the tower, Ezio among them, and the rush upwards, away from the flames burning the base of the tower, became frantic. Around him, Ezio saw men push their fellows out of the way in order to survive, and some soldiers fell, howling, into the flames below. Ezio knew he had to get to the top before the flames caught up with him. Reaching it, he took a great leap of faith onto the battlements, just as the blazing tower collapsed behind him, causing murderous chaos beneath. There was fierce fighting on the ramparts, but already hundreds of Navarrese soldiers had got down into the town itself, and the Spanish trumpets were sounding the retreat into the citadel at the centre of Viana. The town seemed as good as retaken. Cesare would be triumphant, and his wealthy brother-in-law would doubtless reward him richly. Ezio would not allow that to happen. Running along the high wall, Ezio ducked and dived among the fighting soldiers as the Navarrese cut down the Spanish troops who had been left behind in the retreat. Ezio located Cesare, cutting his way through enemy troops as a child uses a stick to smash through tall grass. Cesare was impatient to take the citadel, and once clear of the men who attempted to block his way, he sped down a stairway on the inner wall and through the town, with Ezio seconds behind him. Ahead of them, the citadel had already opened its doors. All the fight had gone out of the Spanish, and the Count of Lerin was ready to parley. But Cesare was not a merciful man. "Kill them! Kill them all!" he shouted to his troops. With superhuman speed, he ran into the citadel and up the narrow stone staircases within it, cutting down anyone who got in his way. Ezio kept pace with him until they reached the topmost battlements of the citadel, where Cesare stood alone, cutting down the flagpole bearing the Spanish flag. When he turned, there was but one way out, and there stood Ezio, blocking it. "There is nowhere for you to run, Cesare," said Ezio. "It is time to pay your debts." "Come on then, Ezio," snarled Cesare. "You brought down my family. Let's see how you settle your debts." Such was their impatient fury, they closed on each other immediately, man to man, using only their fists as weapons. Cesare got the first blow in, his right fist swinging wildly at Ezio's head. Ezio ducked under the punch, but a fraction too late, so that Cesare's knuckles glanced off the assassin's temple. Ezio staggered, giving Cesare cause to cry out in triumph. "No matter what you do, I will conquer all. But first, I will kill you and everyone you hold dear. As for me, I cannot die. Fortuna will not fail me." "Your hour is come, Cesare," Ezio replied. Recovering his composure and stepping back, he drew his sword. Cesare loosed his own blade in response, and the two men began to fight in earnest. Ezio swung his blade viciously towards his foe's head, the blade sweeping a lethal flat arc through the air. Cesare was shocked by the speed of the attack, but managed to raise his own blade in a clumsy parry, his arm shuddering with the impact. Ezio's sword bounced away, and Cesare thrust with his own attack, his balance and focus regained. The men circled on the parapet, flicking the tips of their swords in a swift burst of swordplay. Ezio stepped quickly forward, leading Cesare's blade off to the right, then twisting his wrist and aiming the point of his sword towards Cesare's exposed left flank. Cesare was too quick, though, and slapped Ezio's sword aside. Then he used the opening to flick his blade at Ezio, who responded by raising his wrist and using the bracer to deflect the blow. Both men stepped back, wary once again. Cesare's skill as a swordsman had clearly not been hampered by the new disease. "Pah, old man! Your generation is finished. It is my turn now, and I will not wait any longer. Your antiquated systems, your rules and hierarchies, all of them must go." Both men were tiring, and they confronted each other, panting. Ezio replied, "Your new regime will bring tyranny and misery to all. I know what is best for the people of Italy, not a bunch of old men who wasted their energy fighting to get to the top years ago." "Your mistakes are worse than theirs." "I do not make mistakes. I am the enlightened one." "Enlightenment comes through years of thought, not through blind conviction." "Ezio Auditore, your time has come." Cesare slashed with his sword, striking an unexpected and cowardly blow. But Ezio was just quick enough to parry, carry through, and, catching Cesare off balance, seize his wrist and wrench the sword from his grip, sending it clattering to the flagstones. They were on the edge of the battlements, and far below, Navarrese's troops were beginning to celebrate. There was no looting, though, for they had regained a town which was their own. Cesare went for his dagger, but Ezio slashed at his opponent's wrist with his sword, cutting into the tendons so that it hung limply, disabled. Cesare staggered back, and his face grimaced with pain and anger. "The throne was mine," he said, like a child who has lost a toy. "Wanting something does not give you the right to have it." "What do you know? Have you never wanted something that much?" "A true leader empowers the people he rules." "I can still lead mankind into a new world." Seeing that Cesare was standing inches from the edge, Ezio raised his sword. "May your name be blotted out. Requiescat in pace." "You cannot kill me! No man can murder me!" "Then I will leave you in the hands of fate," replied Ezio. Dropping his sword, Ezio seized Cesare Borgia, and with a single deft movement, threw him off the battlements. He plunged onto the cobblestones 100 feet below. But Ezio did not look down. The weight of his long fight against the Borgia was lifted from his heart. Chapter 66. It was Midsummer's Day again, Ezio's 48th birthday. Ezio, Machiavelli, and Leonardo were gathered in the newly refurbished Tiber Island headquarters, which was now a proud building for all to see. "It's a very small birthday party," commented Leonardo. "Now, if you had let me design something for you, a real pageant—" "Save that for 2 years' time," smiled Ezio. "We have invited you for another reason." "Which is?" asked Leonardo, full of curiosity. Machiavelli, sporting a slightly crooked but fully healed shoulder, said, "Leo, we want to extend an invitation to you." "Another one?" "We want you to join us," said Ezio solemnly, "to become a fellow member of the Brotherhood of the Assassins." Leonardo smiled gravely. "So my bombs were a success." He was silent for a moment, then said, "Gentlemen, I thank you. And you know that I respect your goals and will support them for as long as I live. I will never disclose the secrets of the assassins to anyone." He paused. "But I tread a different path, and it is a solitary one. So forgive me." "Your support is almost as valuable as your becoming one of us. But can't we persuade you, old friend?" "No, Ezio. Besides, I'm leaving." "Leaving? Where are you going?" "I shall return to Milan, and then I'm going to Amboise." "To France?" "They say it is a noble country, and it is there I choose to end my days." Ezio spread his hands. "Then we must let you go, old friend." He paused. "This, then, is a parting of the ways." "How so?" asked Leonardo. "I am returning to Florence," replied Machiavelli. "My work there is far from done." He winked at Ezio. "And I still have that book to write." "What will you call it?" Machiavelli looked levelly at Ezio. "The Prince," he replied. "Send Claudia back to me." "I will. She misses Rome, and you know she'll support you as long as you continue your work as mentor of the Brotherhood." Machiavelli glanced at the water clock. "It is time." The 3 men rose as one, and embraced each other solemnly. "Goodbye. Goodbye. Goodbye." This audiobook was recorded at Chatterbox Audio and produced and published by Penguin Books Limited, recording copyright 2013.